Alright, hello everyone, so today we are going to be going over 20 ideas you must know if you want to play the Catalan. And this is a video that I myself have been looking quite forward to making. Because although the Catalan, it is a very popular opening at the elite level, moreover I find it to be very effective at the club or amateur level. And by the way, for those of you who do not know, the Catalan is what usually arises via, there are a couple of different move orders, but one very popular one is the Queen's Gambit declined, where after knight f3, knight f6, white will play g3. Another very popular move order is d4, knight f6, c4, e6, g3, avoiding the Nimzo Indian in this position with knight c3, but also avoiding the Queen's Indian that can often arise if we play knight f3 in this position and b6, because in this position when white plays g3 immediately, b6 is a lot less strong because now bishop g2 forces a concession from black, most likely d5, when black doesn't really want to play both these moves d5 and b6 at the same time. And so for that reason, in this position, black's most popular move is to play d5 when after once again knight f3, we are back in the Catalan. And one last thing I'll say about the Catalan is that it can also arise not just via d4 openings, but also via the move orders 1 knight f3 or c4. For example, c4, a very common thing we'll get is knight f3, g3, e6, knight f3, d5, and white could play what we'd call a neo-Catalan, avoiding playing d4 immediately. But of course, if you're like me and you love the Catalan, you will play d4. And for that reason, I expect this video to be useful for a wide range of players, but without further ado, let's dive right into the first section, which is going to be on the closed Catalan. And so what exactly is the closed Catalan? And the closed Catalan, basically, for those of you who don't know, well, you're going to know very soon, it's basically any setup where black doesn't take on c4, and they instead decide to develop their pieces in any number of ways, usually involve their bishop to e7, or sometimes d6 also, c6, playing the knight into d7, castling, playing b6, and developing their bishop to one of these squares. A very natural setup, and this is what for most players, when they start playing the Catalan, or even have been playing the Catalan for a while, especially below the master level, is what you can actually expect to face most of the time. So it's very important that you watch this section and really sort of try to absorb the main key ideas, because if you are able to do so, you'll probably also do very well in your games. But basically the first point we're going to be covering, this one can arise by a couple of different move orders, but I actually want to start from this position where black actually attempts to play a Queen's Indian and plays b6, despite of the fact, once again, as I discussed just then, we haven't played knight f3, blocking our bishop from attacking the rook on this diagonal, and black has to make this concession by playing d5. But this can also arise via after d5, so let's say knight f3 in this position, we just develop castles, and black usually, if they're going to play a closed Catalan, will play c6, but some people will also play b6, completely omitting the c6 move, when this is going to reach a very similar position to what we're looking at after b6. We're going to take here and take. But okay, let's see how we do things here. So let's play bishop g2, d5. Again, we take. Very important. Play knight f3. And basically the point to understand is that this structure where black is forced to take back with the pawn on d5, and I mean the other option was to take back with like what, a knight. This also isn't very good. They're giving up a lot of the center. This whole structure is basically just very passive for black, and it gives white very good chances for an advantage. So we castle, black has a bit of an option. Sometimes they'll develop the bishop to d6, but e7 is a bit more common. And after knight c3 castles, white has a very important move that I'd like you guys to remember. And you could develop the bishop to f4 and just develop your pieces to sort of natural looking squares. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But a very difficult move for black to face is actually knight e5. Because the most common move by far, by the way, in the Lee chess database, is for black to play knight bd7, but this is already a crucial mistake. And if you'd like to try and pause the video and find what white's move is, I suggest you do so. But nonetheless, it's to play queen a4 in this position. But our point is basically that if black just sits back and does nothing, we're going to take on d7, and if they take with the knight, we're going to win a pawn, and if they take with the queen, well, again, we just exchange queens and then win a pawn. And if they try to do something about that, like play knight takes e5, then after d takes e5, again, they still run into trouble. If they go to knight e4, we win a pawn like that. If they go back to d7, of course, that also loses a pawn. And that sort of leaves knight e8, but the problem here is that now, with a very nice blow, knight takes d5, bishop takes c5, rook d1, and c6, e4, white is going to be winning back their material, and after, let's say, knight c7, takes, I believe we just have a big positional advantage, isolated queen's pawn, probably going to drop eventually, bishop pair, not too much more you can ask from the opening. Which is why actually in this position after queen a4, I think black's best move might even be to play knight b8, but of course, very unpleasant, not something that many players are actually going to entertain. And so you can really just internalize it. If black can't really play knight b7 at this early stage and queen a4 already is more or less killing black, then black is going to have a very difficult time doing anything, because they might have to play a passive move like c6 before they develop the knight. Since also if they try to go for a more active approach like c5, that runs into d takes c5, b takes c5, queen b3, and again, black really struggles to hold together their position as there's all this pressure on d5 is coming, also the bishop on b7. If queen b6 is played, knight takes d5 is a very typical tactic winning a pawn. So basically, long story short, if you're facing this sort of Queen's Indian setup, or where black plays d5 in this position, then goes b6, you snap on d5, you put knight in c3, and it is incredibly difficult for black to really hold together their position. However, coming back to the position we were just looking at, where, we examined what happens when black plays b6, usually black will instead play a different move like knight bd7 or c6. Usually if they play knight bd7 though, they're going to play c6 eventually, so they usually just transpose. When in these sorts of positions, it's very important to understand we don't want to take on d5, because what's usually going to happen here is that black's is going to play e takes d5, and notice how now we've actually opened up black's light squared bishop, a piece that before was sort of locked inside the pawn chain and very difficult to develop. That's what a lot of white advantage in the closed Catalan is based on. So c takes d5 would really be a serious strategic mistake. Do not do this. Instead, what usually happens is queen c2, developing the queen to a square where it protects this pawn a little bit, and also eyes the e4 square. We're going to see how that's very important soon. Where after black, say, plays knight bd7, we will play not knight c3, which looks like a very natural developing move, the knight, coming to its most active square. But rather than knight bd2, we're going to examine a bit later what happens after knight c3, but just trust me, for now, knight bd2 is what you want to play. When after b6, again, you might sort of be tempted to take on d5, since now e takes d5, queen takes c6 is a problem. But this time after b6, c takes d5 rather. Sometimes white will go into this structure, but usually you need to have some sort of like bishop already on f4 or rook on the c file to really have any sort of advantage in this sort of position if you're going to open the c file like this. Otherwise, once again, you're just sort of trading off your more important c4 pawn for black's less important one on c6, giving up a lot of your space advantage. But rather, the key idea in this position is that after b6, white is going to play e4 and blast open the position. And if you are to take away one single thing from the video, it's going to be the e4 break. A lot of players actually, especially the first time I faced Catalan actually, this was all the way back in like 2016. I was playing a guy around my age. He was like around 2100 feet though. I was like 1800. I'd never seen the Catalan in my life actually before, which once again is another reason to play the Catalan. A lot of people not only just don't know about it, but they have never really seriously studied it, which makes it very strong. But I mean, of course, basically the point is that we gain space in the center, and black's most natural looking move, d takes e4, is already a bit dubious. What black sort of is supposed to do rather is to keep the tension with a move like bishop b7 or maybe even bishop a6. And following up on that, again, just repeating these moves just to sort of drill it into your mind, spaced repetition I guess you could say, knight bd2, b6, e4. Again, looking at this dubious move, d takes e4, this is what a lot of you guys are going to face if you play the Catalan. A lot of people, again, they don't really know what they're doing, they just sort of take on e4. A very natural response in a lot of openings, but in the Catalan it just so happens, especially this position, that it's not so great. So after knight takes e4, takes, queen takes e4, bishop b7, we bring a rook to d1, and let's say after knight f6, both queen moves are sort of okay, but in this position I like queen c2 for a reason that we're going to see very soon, which is that say if black plays a move like queen c8 to prepare this move c5, by the way, c5, very important move in the Catalan for, or the closed Catalan for black, sort of trying to break open and counterattack the d4 pawn and open their bishop up on this diagonal. Since if they try to do c5 immediately, we just take on c5 and win a pawn because boom, discovered attack. So a lot of the times black will try and prepare this with a move like queen c8. By the way, note if they play something like queen c7, we can play bishop f4 with tempo. That's very nice. They can block, but after bishop d6, queen takes d6, we are going to, well, first of all, they can't even play c5 at the moment because now the bishop's not protected, but we also have a very nice thematic move, c5. And that's what I'm going to explain as well. This is an improved version of what we're going to look at actually, because we've traded off the darks with bishops. But after queen c8, again, a very thematic move is to play c5, just simply stopping black from playing c5 themselves. And in many openings, c5 is sort of, you're told not to play this, it's too committal, weaken stuff like the d5 square. But in the Catalan, especially the closed Catalan, like this sort of position where we're blocking off the bishop on this diagonal. It's very difficult for them to play c5 and liberate that guy now. The fact that we're weakening the d5 square and perhaps giving the black knight like an outpost in d5 to sit on, we don't really care that much, to be honest, because yeah, they get the d5 square, they can have like one good piece in the position, but that's pretty much as good as stuff gets for black. They have one good piece in the position, but that's as good as their position gets. Like, really internalize that. Like, they're gonna get the knight on d5, right? But then, like, what do they do from there? They don't have any pawn breaks. White's gonna gain space on both sides of the board. We're gonna do stuff. We're gonna get active pieces. And black just kind of has to sit there and be like, but I have an active knight on d5, and what are we going to say to that? We don't care. And just to show one instructive Grandmaster's game to really just illustrate how bad this position is for black, it's already more than +1 to give you a computer evaluation, since people like that. Rook d8 was played in this game, bishop e3, knight d5. White retreated back to d2. We're in a bit of a tempo, but we don't really mind. We're actually kind of saying that the knight on d5, we have almost provoked it there in a sense. Anyways, after b takes e5, d takes e5, a5. Black prevents white from playing b4 and holding on to this pawn because it's always going to be en passant. But no problem, we bring a rook to the e1 square, very small improving move. Queen b8, again just another very small improving move. Backing up the c5 pawn in anticipation of black's next move, which is going to be queen a7, trying to attack that guy. But we've already kind of protected it, so no big deal. And again, a very typical idea in the Catalan to go h4. Just gaining space on the king side, also sort of making way for ideas like knight g5. It's actually happened on the next move, when we're not going to take back with the bishop, but rather we're going to take back with the pawn. And now what White's idea is actually is that we're going to play a move like bishop e4 in the next move, attacking the h7 pawn. And it's very difficult for black to defend that with a move like knight f6. Now, well, impossible because we simply take it. And already at this point, white just simply has a huge advantage. Space advantage, bishop pair, all black's pieces are passive. Again, the only good thing about their position is a knight on d5. But if all you have in your position is one good piece, that's not really enough to have a good position. So black played knight e7, but after this, their position fell apart very quickly. Rook d1, some small improving moves, g4 eventually. And yeah, at this point you can see things are really falling apart. The defenses are cracking. The h7 pawn falls. We sort of recollect our pieces, but this knight sort of trapped on the edge of the board, and its only way to come back to humanity or civilization is to give itself up and then have the king side be absolutely destroyed. Not really a good way to go about things, so black resigned in this position. Another very common thing that many of you guys are going to face when you play the Catalan is people playing in the sort of fashion of the semi-Slav, where they try to play this sort of setup with c6, knight b7, and instead of putting the bishop on e7, a more semi-Slav type thing to do is bishop d6. But this setup is actually quite bad, but this is also what I actually did the very first time I played against Catalan and had no idea what to go for. It just seemed like a very sort of natural, harmonious way to develop. But little did I know, it's actually complete dog shit, and I'm going to show you why that is. So basically, let's say we play these moves, castles, bishop d6. What I don't want you guys to do is to play something like queen c2, castles, knight bd2, because after rook e8, e4, now after takes, if a bishop was an e7, this would be very good for white, but unfortunately with the bishop on d6, black can play this very active move e5, and believe it or not, they're already more than fine. If we take, they're fine with this, and if we play something like d5, they just simply play like knight f6, and then they're going to take on d5 next, and maybe they can even just win a pawn, but they can also play something like e4, and believe me, this is not good for white at all. So what white has to do in this position is actually to play, well, not has to do technically, but what their best option is to do is to go for this rather counterintuitive looking move, knight fd2. The point being that after castles, knight c3, now we're preparing to play e4, but now we're going to do so under much better circumstances, as after takes, because the bishop is on d6, right? This whole like knight fd2 thing, right, if the bishop was on e7, it would make absolutely no sense, but with the bishop on d6, making sure we recapture with a knight gains that very important tempo. And now if we just go something like bishop e7, we play like bishop f4, we have very active pieces, white rather is doing very nicely. If knight f6, we could maybe play a move like knight c3, but we don't even have to do that. We could even just play like queen d3, bring the rook to the center, and black has a very passive position. And a very nice line also is that, let's say like bishop c7, we can play this move bishop g5, provoking a weakness from the black camp, since of course if you play knight f6, then you get like double pawns in front of your king, and that's never so good And if you play f6, well, then you create some other weaknesses, like the e6 pawn. If you try to get rid of that, then d5, and this is not looking so good for black. But on the note I was discussing earlier with you guys, like I was talking briefly here how we want to put a knight on d2 to support this e4 break instead of playing something like knight c3. And basically the simple reason is that when we play knight c3, is that, okay, if black plays b6, this is perfectly fine. At least if they take on e4, there's another option they have though, which is actually to take on c4. And that's precisely what can happen in this position even before they play b6, is to just simply play d takes c4. And now there's no easy way to win back the pawn. Black's going to play b5 next if allowed. We could play a4 to stop that, but a5. And in all honesty, black just has a pretty comfortable position. Like, I don't know if we play knight e5, they're just going to take and go knight d5. Nothing really we can do here. Pretty meh position, to be honest. Like knight e4 if you want to attack this, but then just b5. So yeah, that's basically why usually in these positions I put a knight on d2, not c3. You could try and play something like rook d1 and then go b3 and then go knight c3, since now this pawn's sort of backed up, but we're going to look at this position very shortly. So this is a bit more of a insight from the black perspective, but it's important to understand from the white perspective as well, which is that black is sometimes, I'm going to play rook d1 here to sort of illustrate the point. We just looked at this as well, of course, but when black plays b6, they of course can develop the bishop to b7, but what about putting the bishop on a6? And basically my sort of view on this is that bishop a6 is usually more active and also more challenging to face than black going bishop b7. Bishop b7 always tends to be a bit more passive. I also find that people who are generally more quote-unquote booked up will usually play some line involving bishop a6, maybe not in this exact position, but especially in lines like, say, we'll look at this a bit more later, but there's some lines where black will give a check on b4 first. Again, I'll explain this nuance later in the third section of move orders, but they'll go like bishop e7 now and then get these similar looking positions. Basically the point is that bishop on d2 is kind of a pain in the ass because we can't bring our knight to d2. The bishop's hogging that square for itself, and in these sorts of positions it's sort of considered that black's most critical move is to go bishop a6, not bishop b7. So I would apply a similar logic to this position, where basically the only difference is the fact this bishop is on the better, somewhat ironically, better on c1 where it's more backward than d2 where it's technically developed, right? But I would nonetheless still assume that something like bishop a6 is better in this position. Why? Because, well, when the bishop goes to b7, it sort of allows white in a sense to develop their knight to the more active c3 square, whereas when black goes to a6, again, if you go knight c3, they're gonna take on c4. Trust me, they're gonna take. It does look a bit risky because it's weakening this diagonal and stuff, but it's really nothing to be too concerned about. For example, if you play knight e5 in this position, black can just take and go knight d5, and if you go e4, there's actually knight b4, since if rook takes d8, knight takes c2, and if you try and play like, I don't know, like queen e2, there's just knight d3, I think. Or actually, to be honest, even something like queen 7 just might be fine. Like, I mean, what are you going to do? Take this? There's like queen takes e5, black's up a pawn, white's pawn structure looks like shit. Not a position you want to play with white. Of course, knight e5, it's not forced there, but generally speaking, if you're going to play knight c3 against bishop a6, you need to be a little bit careful about the fact that you're going to be essentially playing a gambit. And if you don't want to play the gambit, it probably means you're going to put your knight in a slightly more passive square like d2, which is a small psychological victory for the black player who is once again putting their bishop on the a6 square. Coming back to this position that we once again have seen and we're going to continue seeing a couple more times throughout this video. Also, I should mention d takes c4 is technically the main line. Again, more on this later, but c6, queen c2, knight b7, knight b2, b6, and after e4, we looked at d takes e4 and how that's not such a great move for black, and we also talked about how keeping the tension with something like bishop b7 is probably a bit better. And I want to briefly discuss how to play against this sort of approach. And first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to play the logical e5, gaining space, forcing knight e8, and now we're going to play c takes d5, a very important move. Sort of trying to clarify the central situation in a way. We don't really want to allow black to play c5 first. Let's say, like, for example, we're going to play rook e1 after we play c takes d5, but if we say played rook e1, immediately c5 would be quite annoying, like bishop takes d5, and I've never checked this position exactly with an engine before, but if I were to guess, I would probably already guess that black is equal and maybe bordering on slightly better. So in order to avoid this sort of situation, we play c takes d5, and after c takes d5, they could also play e takes d5, but we're going to sort of follow a similar formula to what I'm going to show after c takes d5 as well. We're going to play like rook e1. The positions are inherently different, but the moves just sort of happen to be similar. So knight f1, and let's say like rook c8, we're going to go queen d1, gain off the c file from any discovered threats. Knight e3, knight f5 coming next basically is the point. And you know, with the stronghold on e5, white has reason to be pretty optimistic. But what most of the time you face, and what most of the time I have faced, is c takes d5, keeping the structure a little bit more symmetrical. And again, we're going to play rook e1. And at first, it might look like, Sam, what the hell are we doing putting the rook on e1? The e file is completely closed. There's no way that guy is ever opening up. Maybe if black plays e6, right? Sorry, f6 rather, but like what the hell, mate? But the point is that now basically in these positions, well, first of all, like what even are we aiming for in this sort of position, right? Well, some people might sort of be like, use the open c file, but trust me, we're not going to be doing that. Black is the only one who really is going to be trying to use that, and often not successfully so. You're going to see what I mean soon. So basically what our plan is to do rather is to use the fact that, you know, our pawn structure, a million people gave this lecture, you know how your pawns are pointing this way, so you need to attack on the king side, rah rah rah. And so basically rook e1, despite it looking like it has nothing to do with a kingside attack, is actually the beginning of a kingside attacking plan, where basically we're going to either use the f1 square to bring our bishop to f1 and then d3 where it takes I at the king side, or we're going to play knight f1 in combination with some sort of h4, knight e3 or knight h2, and some sort of attacks that looks very similar to what we'd get in another opening, actually the King's Indian attack, briefly showing this on the board. It can arise via the French defense, for example, where we get this sort of scheme, which looks quite innocuous at first sight, but can often lead to these raging kingside attacks, where again, white is going to be going for this rather kingside attack. Rather, we play h4, knight h2, h5, and we just try to like absolutely hack black on the king side, and it's usually quite fun because a lot of black players don't know what they're doing, even though objectively it's supposed to be okay. Yeah, fun variation for white. But basically, to carry on the line a little bit longer, rook e1, rook c8, queen a4, sort of pretending like we're going to take on a7. I mean, it is technically a threat, right? So very often black will tend to still play something like a6. But basically, again, in this position, we're going to continue along with the attacking plan. There's a bunch of different things you could do. Maybe h4, bishop f1, knight f1. I think they're all technically playable. I'd probably not go bishop f1 this exact position. I'd probably stick more towards knight f1. But there always is that potential later down the line to go for something like that. Also, I should just continue the line a little bit longer. Let's say like knight f1, b5, queen c7. A lot of people will play this way, trying to like infiltrate on the c file a little bit, but it really just doesn't get anywhere after we play something like knight e3. We covered this square, and so, you know, blacks put all their skill points basically into the c file, but then like it turns out actually that the c file is irrelevant and that they've wasted their whole life playing for something that doesn't matter, and we're just going to attack on the king side. And yeah, in general, I would be pretty happy about this position of white. And so for the last segment, I guess you could say, of the closed Catalan for this video, we're going to be talking about what happens in this sort of position when black opts to transform the pawn structure a little bit by playing something like knight e4 and then following up with f5, playing in the spirit of the stone wall. And to be honest, I don't have any refutations to give you of this. I mean, you could play like knight c3 and like rook b1, b4, that's a sort of more aggressive plan. You could just go like b3, bishop b2. You could also maybe even try to go like b3 and then bishop a3, trading off the dark sword bishops. A very common plan, the stone wall. This is viable, definitely. Is it winning? Maybe not, but you know, definitely something you can go for. But yeah, I mean, not really too much to add here. It's just sort of something to be aware of, like you don't get like, you know, caught off guard, like, whoa, we're going to like a stone wall now. I mean, this is something that happens sometimes. Is it like objectively the best possible plan to Catalan? No, but it's also not a bad one. Pretty solid, I guess you could say, because I mean the stone wall is solid, so just keep this in mind. Yeah, not really too much more to add here, to be honest. So now we're here for the second section of the video on the open Catalan. To some, this would arguably be the more interesting one, you could say, but for many it will also be the one that you see much less of, depending on your level, of course. If you're like a titled player for some reason watching my videos, you know, this might be the more common one. But there are two sorts of open Catalan. Well, I mean, there's a bunch of different lines in the open Catalan to begin with, but basically the the open Catalan can arise via two main ways, where either they'll take on c4 immediately, or they'll play this line of bishop e7, castles, and then take on c4 and enter what is sort of known as the main line of the Catalan, I guess you could say. This one is sort of called the delayed open, whereas this one is just sort of the open, I guess, is the way of putting it. But we're going to be combining this into sort of one section with some sort of typical ideas. But the most fundamental idea is basically in the open Catalan that black really needs to monitor the light squared bishop. Because I'm just going to put some moves on the board, but the following situation I'm about to illustrate. By the way, knight c6 is the main theoretical move here. C takes d4 isn't so good. Let's say queen takes d4. d4 also perfectly playable, but the endgame we do not mind at all. So takes, so let's say knight b5. Some moves. This position might look like it's equal material, and that's a correct observation. But this position in of itself is absolutely terrible for black. The engine will evaluate it as around like +1 maybe, but practically very difficult position to play for black. And the reason is precisely of what we're going to be calling the Catalan bishop, which is particularly prevalent in these open lines where black does not play precisely, and then white just sort of has this long-term advantage with their really amazing bishop on this long diagonal versus black's really crappy one on the c8 square, which can't for its life develop itself anywhere. Like say for example, if you want to try play rook b8 to play bishop d7, because if you play bishop d7 immediately, of course you hang a pawn, but I mean this doesn't get anywhere because bishop f4, bring the rooks to the center. I mean, first of all you have to go back. So really hellish position, and this really illustrates a lot of the dangers strategically, in a sense, that are associated with black entering these sorts of positions where they enter the open Catalan by once again, you know, taking on c4 and opening this diagonal. And so to combat that, we're going to be looking at one line here where they play d takes e4 on move 6, not on move 4, where, you know, black's plan is very much associated with once again countering this bishop on this long diagonal, where it can very often, if once again not dealt with, just become a pest very quickly. And basically white's main line by far these days is to play a4. The old main line was to take on c4, but these days it's sort of considered, by the way, I mean, once again, notice how all black's moves are in sort of the spirit of, once again, countering the bishop on g2, countering the Catalan bishop. But yeah, basically these days, these positions, I mean, there's definitely some theory that goes a bit deeper, like this alone isn't enough to necessarily equalize with black. But on very general grounds, like black is already pretty happy here, because once again, this bishop is pretty nullified on the g2 square. So usually people play a4 these days to stop b5, of course, and only now preparing to take on c4, but people usually get around this by playing this move bishop d7, and now after queen takes e4 playing bishop c6, once again trying to neutralize this diagonal anyway. And look, this is considered after something like bishop f4, bishop g5 to be like somewhere between equal and slightly better for white. I personally prefer these positions a lot more for white, because I've always sort of felt like black isn't really playing for anything more than a draw in these positions. The positions are so solid that it's just like very, very difficult to win for black. But what I really want to highlight here is these ideas with just bishop d7 to c6. Very common method of neutralizing this bishop. There's also another line where technically it happens where black takes on c4 and move 4, and then goes bishop d7 immediately, and if castles, bishop c6. The more critical line is technically to go knight e5, and then there's these lines where white doesn't really want to take, giving up their light squared bishop and tripling the c pawns. That is possible, but not really appealing. Usually what happens is something like this, where black castles long, and then you get some really crazy game. Pretty fun line against Catalan. Is it sound? I'm not sure, but definitely something which is a bit interesting to say the least. This is definitely more of an idea from black's perspective, I guess you could say, but it is important to know this stuff. Another important idea coming back to this position, this is again something more for black, but something you need to be aware of, is that if you go knight e5, this is probably the main theoretical alternative to queen c2 in this position, is that it's generally considered, like say we get something like this of c5, this very much can fall into, again, the sort of dream Catalan position where we just have this bishop roaring on this diagonal, unopposed, very difficult for black to develop. Maybe they're not doing too bad in this exact position. Like, I would definitely 10 times out of 10 take white in this position. So black's best move basically is to, instead of playing c5, which looks like a very natural break in the center, to actually meet this knight e5 move by playing knight c6. When the point is that we're not really scared of something like knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop takes c6, because then after rook b8, like bishop b7, trade this guy off, not really leading anywhere for white. Sometimes this is a bit of like a theoretical side note, like people play knight a3, there's this whole weird line where people like will invite these doubled A pawns on the board, and it's a really weird line. I looked at it a bit yesterday actually, where, you know, of course we have the doubled A pawns, but they have tripled C pawns, their upper pawn as well, but we also have the bishop pair, so we're sort of winning. Not really, but I like to fantasize about that. But usually what happens, the most critical lines like bishop takes C6, knight takes e6, then you get this sort of weird position where this is like very common these days. Black is down a pawn technically, but you know, our king's kind of weak since we lack the presence of the light squared bishop, and black's also like going to bring their rooks to the center very quickly. They're ahead in development. Look at all our pieces, right? Which is personally for me why I've never really liked this whole 95 line. But if this is something you're considering, you know, keep this in mind. Maybe at the level you're at, people won't play knight 6 and they'll go for c5. And again, if you can get a position like this right out of the opening, I mean, this is amazing, right? This is the absolute dream for every Catalan player. You get the bishop rolling on diagonal and you're pretty much winning. However, another interesting line in the sort of open Catalan realm is when black supports the c4 pawn with playing b5, which is a very logical looking move at first, right? I mean, like, why not just play b5 and support the pawn and just be a pawn up? However, the point is that there are some distinct sort of tactical ramifications with potentially opening yourself up on this diagonal. For example, in this position, what we will immediately do is to play a4, challenging the b5 pawn. Not quite playing something like knight e5 immediately, that would be met with knight d5. It's completely playable. I think Magnus might have even played this in his World Championship match against Nepo. I might be mixing stuff up slightly, but not terrible, but also probably not quite the most principled move. But a4, and of course black can't really play a6 since they can't recapture because the rook's hanging at the end of the line, which is why people usually play b4 in this position. You might be like, whoa, what do you mean why? Why can't they play c6? But this is actually the key tactical point I want to highlight, which is after a takes b5, c takes b5, now there's knight g5, and now we're attacking the rook on a8, but black cannot play knight d5 because this queen and knight are actually lined up on this pawn, which now of course just allows us to deliver mate, which actually once again makes this whole c6 move a big blunder. And you might be asking, like, why can't we just go knight g5 immediately? And of course the point is that when we haven't traded off the a and c pawns, that means black can just play c6 now, and we're not really in time to really make things work here. We're just getting kicked back, which is usually why in this position people play like b4 instead. There's actually this also weird modern trend of going bishop b7 instead and going like a6 here, where black basically says like, I'm okay just being down like a pawn, but I have quote-unquote compensation, in the sense that it is a very weird position where they eventually usually play like c5 at some point. They trade off the d and c pawns, and basically what black is saying is that sure, white's up a pawn, but they're so solid and so difficult for white to actually make use of their extra pawn that the position is basically drawn. What often happens very often actually is like, I think some line like this happens maybe, like I'm just sort of making up the moves, but like some random stuff happens. Again, I'm completely just making up the moves for illustrative purposes, but we get some position like this. Ignore that bishop b5 is on the, bishop b4 is on the board, where all the pawns are on one side of the board. White's up a pawn, but can they win this position? That's the real question. But this is one of those lines where I don't really understand why any human would want to play it, because you have no chances of winning, and at best you're just going to draw. So why? I don't get it, but elite players like to do this for some reason. But yeah, b4 is the main line. Again, not super relevant to the sort of theme of this video. I'm not trying to show you all the theory in the world of the Catalan. That would take like a whole year's worth of videos. Maybe not that much, but you get the point, right? Where like knight of d2 is sort of the main line. Black is sort of playing up a pawn, but sorry, I just butchered the move slightly. It was queen c5, bishop e3, this, and you get some position like this where you defend the h2 pawn like this. Black, they're up a pawn, but their position's a little bit sketchy. They have the weak c6 pawn. We can win that back like very quickly, immediately if we want, but there's some like nuances as to how you're like supposed to better play the position, like keep the pawn on the board so you can pressure black more. Fancy stuff like that. But yeah, long story short, you really got to watch out in many of these Catalan lines playing b5 like this as black, and also as white you have to be very alert for opportunities to like jump on something like knight g5. More specifically, once again, in this position where black is sort of overloaded, they can't defend the h7 pawn and also this diagonal at the same time with knight d5. And the following idea we're going to discuss is, again, it's very important, very thematic. I'm going to show it through the lens of this line in the open Catalan, one of the main the lines that black can probably go for in, once again, with d takes c4, where in this position, there's numerous options for white. The old main line sort of just go knight c3, e4, and just sort of go for an all-out center, you know, brawl and just say like, black, I'm gonna fucking kill you, right? But it doesn't quite work, to be honest. Sort of these days, it's sort of being concretely figured out, especially with engines, that white is sort of not really gaining much of an advantage. So what people sort of switched to, maybe in the 2010s, let's say, was playing for more of this e3 base up, where you just try and go queen e2 and take on c4 next. Of course, if you go like queen c4, so sorry, queen c2 in this position, try to attack c4 immediately, then I think the issue might just be knight takes d4, but it could even be b5 actually. No, I just checked, it's not b5. Apparently there's some like weird line where like you go, maybe it's like queen d1 or something technically. That doesn't matter though, knight takes d4. Fair to say that it's not really working out for white. So e3, and basically the point here is if b5 rather, e5 is just losing in terrible fashion, because now if you take, you lose the exchange, and if you don't do that, then you'll lose material here. So obviously b5 is a big mistake, which is why people usually try to prepare b5 with something like bishop d7. But then what white's going to do is they're going to play queen e2, once again trying to take this. Some people actually just allow that and play this late line, which was recommended in the book that I've mentioned in this channel before, playing 1d4, d5, a classical repertoire. Good book overall, but this line in the Catalan, not so great, to be honest. Black basically tries to equalize by first protecting the b7 pawn and then playing e5. Yeah, to be honest, not, again, the best line in the world. What people usually, the most mainline position to do is to play b5 and then after b3. This is the whole point I really wanted to show. We play b3. Because if we just let the pawn sit there forever, our position does sort of look bad. But once we play b3, this is a really key idea. We essentially accept we're not going to be winning back the pawn. That's just not going to be happening. But we do get the open c and a files now. And with something like bishop d2, rook c1, knight c3, we really do get a lot of compensation. And it is these positions that, from the white perspective, I've always quite liked playing. The engines might say it's around equal, but keep in mind black's also up a pawn, so that could have some practical implications, like such as black is up a pawn, but engine says it's equal. Probably means that white's position might be a little bit easier to play. Again, that's no generalization, depends on the position, but this is definitely an example of one which I would say that isn't exactly wrong. For example, a natural sequence of moves could be the following, but after just simply knight c3, we're not afraid of any trades like this, because then they get rid of their knight, they'll throw on d5, and if they like knight b4, I don't know, we're going to go like knight e4, shove our knight into c5 square, maybe play knight e5, and you can just see we have a lot of good control over important squares like c5. We definitely have very strong compensation in this position for the pawn. Maybe we're even already a bit better. So yeah, just keep in mind this whole b3 idea. Pops up in a lot of lines in the Catalan. Especially also note, we're not going to do this if black hasn't played b5. Like, if we just randomly played b3 here, this wouldn't really make any sense because they don't really have any clear weaknesses in their position. But once we play queen e2, sort of provoke b5, and then we play b3, now there's some serious weaknesses in the position to target. This long diagonal is weak, c5 square is weak. There's also, I guess, the c7 pawn. If this knight ever, you know, you get it out of the way and just like attack c7 pawn, that could also become something. So yeah, definitely a key idea that you need to know in the open Catalan. And so the last key idea that we're going to be talking about is going to once again be in this line where black plays a6, but this time around they're going to go for b5 again. And we talked about earlier how there's some, you know, like a4, knight g5 stuff that maybe happens sometimes, but in this line that doesn't really quite work. Well, I mean, we could play a4, but usually in this position when they go for an early d takes e4, b5, we're going to do some variation of knight e5, a4, and now after bishop b7, again you could play b3. It's a funny story actually. I actually had this in the over the board game last week. I played b3, I didn't really remember the theory so well, to be honest. And then my opponent just busts out c3, and I'm like, okay. And after some thinking, like 30 minutes actually, to be honest, I played e4, knight f6. Well, actually, I calculated lines with knight f6, and I was like looking at this whole thing, like, you know, I sack a pawn, and I'm like, okay, I think I'm doing pretty well here. Like, they go f5, I play queen h5, I'm murdering them like that. If they go knight d6, I take, and I go like queen f3, and I'm attacking this, Yeah, I'm pretty much winning, except for the fact that in this position, I mean, okay, that line wasn't exactly forced, but like in this position, they actually just played b4 and let me take the knight, but basically the point was that at some point I'd probably have to give back my knight on b1 because it's trapped in here. Super weird position, super weird stuff. But a better move, I think, probably is to go for e4. And the typical idea I want to show here is this whole plan where when you're faced with black sort of playing very greedily, sometimes you can just sort of, in conjunction with e4, of course, bust open the center and play d5. And already black's best moves to play like bishop e7 just completely ignore this guy. Like, for example, one very flashing line is if e takes d5, knight takes d5, white can actually just play queen h5, making use of the fact once again the knight vacated the square, was controlling this, important h5 square, I guess you could say. And now black is basically defensive. They go like queen f6, maybe we can play multiple things, but one very nice one's knight takes c6. They take back, we take on d5, and I mean, yeah, not looking too good for black. And of course, in this position, if they play g6, we just take and go queen e5, puzzle rush stuff. But also, I should mention like c takes d5, this is pretty natural, but here we just go like knight takes b5, rook e1's always on the horizon, queen a4 is quite, dangerous threat that, black has to watch out for. And yeah, pretty much in all these positions, white is maybe not like winning, that's definitely a stretch, but definitely better, and there's a lot of pressure on black in my opinion. So yeah, this is like one of those lines, it's like you're gonna have to memorize a bit, but just the idea I want, for at least for this video, right, for you guys to internalize this. It's also worth noting that a lot of people don't really have the balls to play something like going for a d takes c4 on these lines for a quick like b5 or b5 immediately in this position. This is also a thing because, you do win a pawn, but you're creating some inherent risks, on this diagonal. You're behind development a bit. If you make it out, great, but if you don't, could end up a little bit unpleasant, yeah? So, but yeah, nonetheless, that's why you're watching this video, so that if you play these sort of people, you won't end up in this sort of position, and you'll instead end up in one like this, where you're slaughtering your opponent with some sort of wild attack. Alright, but now for the most boring section of the video, we're going to be talking about move orders, and this is both inside the Catalan and also on the way to the Catalan. And what do I mean? Well, we're going to see. So, first of all, in this position, like, we looked at this bishop b4 check line earlier, and how there's this very weird option where after bishop d2 you can act like you're a retard and play bishop e7, when it's like, why didn't you play bishop e7 immediately? Why did you spend 2 moves doing that and help your opponent develop? Well, if you watch this video, you're gonna know why. So basically the whole point was that when you play bishop b4 check and then provoke white to play bishop d2 and then go back to e7, now, as we saw in many lines, I mean, I briefly explained this earlier, right, but white, basically, they don't want the bishop on d2. They want to put the knight on d2 and quickly play e4 like that. Now they can't do that, and so they very often have to spend another move with the bishop. Like, there's even some lines actually where, believe it or not, white just plays bishop c1 in this position. This is a legit theoretical move that I've seen before, bishop c1. Because very often when you put the bishop on a square like f4, very often what happens is something like knight h5, and your bishop gets chased around. And if some people play like knight h6 back, hoping to repeat the position, which if you're a super GM you'll do, but if you're one of us, then you'll be quite happy to play knight bd2 in this position and transpose back to your normal stuff. However, there is also the other option in some of these positions to go like f5 for black, so it's worth keeping in mind. Your opponent might not just be one of those people who's just seeking to be annoying, they actually just want to play a stone wall, which again, something that can happen in the Catalan. Also, I should note, however, there's a couple other things I'll just add before ending up on the, this section of the bishop b4 check, which is that black doesn't necessarily have to play bishop e7. There's also this weird line where they go bishop d6, and the idea is sort of like you get these positions where you actually just sort of play for a stone wall by playing knight e4, f5, and generally speaking, the stone wall, you want your bishop on d6 instead of e7. So when you play bishop d6, your opponent's probably aiming for more of this sort of setup. You can also sort of get around this by playing something like knight c3, and like against c6, you go queen c2, you play like some quick e4, and against like castles, you go bishop g5, and I haven't really been too up to date on these lines, but this is sort of considered the most critical approach against bishop d6, trying to exploit the fact that it's not on e7, because these positions, to be honest, I've always considered to be pretty playable for black, to be honest, and I've even played them a bit myself sometimes, so definitely not something to be underestimated. And of course, also remember how, like, when they played bishop d6 immediately and went for these lines, right, we had the whole like knight of d2 thing, whereas again, when the bishop is on d2, not possible, right? So that's another reason as to why inserting a check can be useful. But yeah, also like I'll just mention, I know I said that like literally a minute ago, but you don't necessarily have to play bishop d2. Some people play like knight c3, which technically could be a Nimzo Indian with g3, or even knight bd2, where there's either the lines where black will play b6 and sort of have a weird pseudo Queen's Indian sort of thing, very solid lines, or they'll be more adventurous like I am a lot of the times and actually play d takes c4, grabbing onto the pawn, and these positions can get very complicated and messy very quickly. Another move order thing, which especially for you guys who are not exclusively 1d4 players out there, but maybe like knight f3 or c4 players, the knight f3 move order, or maybe for you guys who are considering expanding out your repertoire, maybe something like knight f3 or c4, there are some distinct benefits to playing this way, namely that, like for example, the lines we just looked at, if you don't play d4 here and you just play bishop g2, and you're okay with, like, say, getting this transposition to the Catalan, which why wouldn't you, right? This can have some real benefits to it, because you avoid some of the main heavyweight lines, like, say, in this position, so bishop g2, like, say we transfer back to the Catalan, like bishop b4 check, the whole d takes c4 thing. You cut out so many lines that a lot of Catalan players have to deal with if they play it through the main move order. If you do it this way, you avoid a lot of this stuff. But nonetheless, there are some cons to doing this. For example, like in this position, your opponent could play d takes c4, they could also play d4, getting like a reverse Benoni. Both of those are very solid lines, nothing to be like losing sleep over necessarily, but it's just worth noting that, you know, you avoid some problems, but you get other ones in return. Which ones you'd rather face, that's something that's up to the individual. Another example of a similar sort of scenario is in these sort of positions, going for knight f3, not c4 immediately, and say in against like e6 or d5, playing g3, and hoping to get once again this sort of transposition, only now playing c4, when again you get to avoid like this bishop b4 check, the d takes c4, well not d takes c4 here, but the other earlier d takes c4 lines. But you have the drawback of this line, like for example around something like bishop f5, where it's not necessarily the end of the world. This whole thing was recommended in the repertoire Keep It Simple 1d4 by Christoph Zielecki. Made a book review on that. I'll maybe leave it up somewhere in the cards, where basically, you know, black is this sort of improved Catalan, I feel like, where we saw very often earlier how in the closed Catalan, black a lot of the times has, or even the open Catalan sometimes has troubles getting this light squared bishop out. So it always felt wrong to me that we were allowing them to get the bishop out like this so early on. But there's some lines, like for example in that book that I mentioned, once again check out the book review, I actually talk a little bit about these positions. It's not necessarily like the end of the world for white if they allow this. There's some concrete things you can do, like if you just don't know any theory and just sort of play autopilot moves, black's completely fine, but you can pose some concrete problems in these lines. I actually slightly like this move order a bit more, however, once black is already committed to e6 and then go g3. I've played this a couple times over the board this year in particular, because now like I avoid all this like, you know, bishop f5 nonsense, where it's like now I know that like, okay, my opponent, if they don't go d5, maybe they'll go like c5 or like b6 or something, and this is all stuff I'm fine with. Like granted, you know, if you play the normal Catalan move order like g3 here, you avoid the Queen's Indians, that's another thing to take into account, but it's not the end of the world necessarily, per se. Something also worth considering, it's tangentially related to the Catalan, but it's not quite the Catalan, is when your opponent will play something like c5 and transpose to the Tarrasch. Like, for example, in this position, c5 is technically the Tarrasch, but a lot of players will sort of stumble into a Tarrasch by accident. Like, for example, play c5 in this move, not realizing that after takes, we've actually transposed to the Tarrasch. And also like knight takes d5, when this is more of called like semi-Tarrasch than a Tarrasch, really. And this is slightly better, I believe, Tarrasch, but again, like, was our opponent intending to go into this? A lot of the time, not really. They just sort of like have never seen the Catalan before. As I was saying before, it's a really big appeal of playing the Catalan. I'll keep saying that over and over again until the day I die, even though my voice is dying in this video. But yeah, also after g3, bishop e7, another very common way people sort of get tricked is they'll play like instead of c6 or dc6 or dc4 rather, or like b6, which also isn't so good as we mentioned earlier. c5 is pretty common, I'd say, in the sense of, you know, again, people are going to transpose to Tarrasch, they don't really know what they're doing, again, Tarrasch transposition. 95 also some of a semi-Tarrasch transposition. I think it's slightly worse here than in this position, because they have the potential, at least after dc5 here, to recapture in one go, whereas here we can like sort of win a tempo, so to speak, since they've gone like boom and then boom. But yeah, just worth pointing out here that, you know, sometimes when you play the Catalan, people are gonna transpose into the charge, and it's good that you realize to transpose into one, and it's good that you realize that your opponent's probably accidentally gone into one, and now they're playing an opening that they don't actually play, at least most of the time. Now for move orders, instead of ones that your opponents are getting tricked by, that I don't want you to get tricked by, because A6, this is one that we're going to start off with. This is a very tricky one. One of my students, he might be watching this actually, he loves to play this opening called the Janowski. And basically, I don't really think that we as Catalan players should play G3 in this position, because there are some sort of benefits associated with black actually not having yet spent a tempo on knight f6 in some lines where they play d takes c4, let's say like bishop g2, and after say knight c6, castles, rook b8. If we go for e3 and this whole thing we went for earlier after b5, like this, now there's a very fundamental difference you have to notice in this position, which is that black has not really committed their bishop on c8 yet, and they can actually put it on the b7 square. And technically this was also possible in the other line for black to go like, I'll just briefly show it on the board here, knight c6, e3, rook b8, and to get like an improved version of the whole bishop d7 line, so now they can play bishop b7 here. But they run into this move knight of d2, and like now they can't really play b5 because we're going to, you know, to take the knight if that's the case, and if they just do nothing, then, well, not nothing necessarily, but a natural move, we just have a big, you know, positional advantage. Again, we have this sort of monster Catalan bishop, really a dream position for white and absolutely a nightmare for black. Which is why usually in this position people play e5, and then you get some really messy position that, you know, anything can happen. But, you know, this is, again, getting way off topic into theory that we don't really want to be discussing too deeply in this video. But again, it's really just to illustrate that, yeah, I don't really think we should play the Catalan against an early a6 like this, when black hasn't yet committed to knight f6. Instead, rather, I would probably just play something like c takes d5. Beware of also knight c3, just d takes c4. This is also not so great for white in my opinion. Probably just take, and go into this line where you play either bishop f4 or bishop g5, and just play, we can't get the Catalan on the board, but sometimes we can't always get what we want. Very typical, like Carlsbad sort of structure. If you play d4, probably something you should know how to play to some extent. Another move order called the triangle one, where I don't really recommend playing g3, because again, black can play like an early d takes c4, and like in these lines where you go knight e5 and you can pile up pressure here, black can very easily meet our bishop b7. Like, look, it's not like we're really worse in these positions, but I would rather not go into these. This feels like a more comfortable position for black than sort of a lot of the normal open Catalan stuff, which is why personally I actually play e3 in this position. If you sort of again want to aim for more of a Catalan sort of thing, queen c2 might be an option you're interested in, since you can often get transpositions here to like a normal closed Catalan, but you have to be aware of d takes c4 and like a quick b5. I've never been a huge fan of these positions, to be honest, which is why I play e3, and I transpose to either a stone wall, which I'm fine going into, or like a Slav, which I usually get in this move order. Boom, 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 boom. But if this is not in your repertoire, this is something you're going to have to think about, because maybe then e3 wouldn't make a lot of sense for you. But anyways, with that being said, I hope you guys have learned something about the Catalan. But anyways, usually, you know, like, subscribe if you know already, leave a comment down below if there's anything you want to talk about, and also my free stuff, newsletter in the description below, and coaching if you're interested in that. But that's going to be it for the video. Hope you guys all have a good day.